I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Amber Duke.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, so we're coming to you in the midst of a week that is not just probably the most consequential for this year or for the election, but one of the more consequential weeks in American history. And we have three topics that we really felt rose to the top of let's call it euphemistically action-packed week, very consequential week. So we're first going to turn to Will. We're going to talk obviously about the assassination attempt on President Trump's life in Butler, Pennsylvania. And then we're going to move to the dismissal of the case against Trump in Florida, and Ben is going to lead that segment. And then finally, we're going to turn to the convention and the VP selection that Trump made just yesterday. We're recording this on Tuesday. So with that, I'll turn it over to Will.
Yeah. So obviously the big news of the week is that there was an assassination attempt on President Trump that failed. Sadly, there was an attendee at the event in the background who lost their life, a guy named Corey Comparatore. So we obviously are incredibly sad for him, and prayers for him and his family, and a couple other people who are seriously injured. I don't know the actual details of, whether they're getting better or what's their status, but I do know that somebody did lose their life. President Trump is lucky to be alive. He got hit in the ear. We're talking a couple inches, and that would have been that for the former president, the leading nominee of the party. So it's almost unthinkable about what would happen then. Who knows? We had a convention this week. Who knows what would have happened? But truly, I think our country kind of escaped a very, very bad outcome as a result of that. It is absolutely unthinkable that the Secret Service could allow this to happen. There's a tweet, which I think by Sean Parnell, which includes a photograph to kind of show how close this rooftop, which this shooter used to hit the president, was. It's only 400 feet, about the distance. You're in a baseball stadium, you're 400 feet. Well, it's just not very far at all. It's 150 yards. And from what I see by people who talk about sniping and rifle fire, like that's an easy shot, an easy rifle shot for people who are skilled with a rifle. And almost all of them think it's unthinkable that the Secret Service could allow someone to get up there. There were people in the audience pointing him out. There was a good window of time. And so this has to be seen as, despite the bravery of some of the Secret Service who went to, protect Trump on the stage, this has to be seen as a complete and utter failure by the Secret Service. There's no circumstance where you should be allowing a shooter that much time and that clear shot on a protectee. And I think Sean Parnell describes it as the most stunning incompetence and negligence in a tactical situation that I've ever been a part of, ever. So it's a remarkable statement from Parnell, who I think was in special operations himself. So a truly terrible thing. Trump's reaction was iconic. No other way to describe it. His willingness to get up and shout fight and be brave. We now know that President Trump has an enormous amount of physical courage. It's not something we knew before. We might have guessed it, but we didn't know it. I mean, the guy simply has courage under fire. He's bold. It's not a surprise that in the aftermath of the attempted assassination that you had a number of people come out and be willing to endorse him, people like Bill Ackman and Elon Musk. So I think he showed a lot of boldness, and just yet another reason to support him. But with that, I want to open it up to people want to talk and what they think about the assassination attempt.
The reaction to it from members of the left was incredibly disturbing, and not even the progressive left, but also the liberal media. You had multiple outlets like CNN and The Atlantic writing headlines describing this as Trump reacting to loud noises, or Trump falling on stage at the rally, when it was incredibly clear that this was an assassination attempt. A lot of these reporters have also basically slithered out of calling it that by citing these vague editorial guidelines where they have to wait for the FBI investigation to conclude before they can state the obvious. We had a staff member for Congressman Benny Thompson's office tweeting essentially that she was upset that the bullet had missed. She was later let go after that came to light. But Benny Thompson, notably, was the member who tried to take Secret Service away from Trump and introduce legislation to do that. So I think, you know, although we avoided the worst case scenario, there's still so much clear division in our country, excuse me, as a result of this.
Yeah, that Benny Thompson thing is remarkable. You know, there was a great, I think Jarvis Best, if you don't follow him on Twitter, he had a great line. He quote tweeted Benny Thompson and said, you know, let me go through the sophisticated and nuanced legal reasons why Benny Thompson decided to suggest this bill. That was the first tweet. The second tweet was he wanted Trump to be assassinated. Like that's the extent of the analysis.
Yeah, that to me, you know, there's all this talk about, well, is the temperature going to be turned down now, and is there going to be unity in the country? The answer is obviously not. We knew within 24 hours after that the media tried to downplay and whitewash what occurred, in part because I think they believe they have guilty consciences. They have egg on their face because there's been assassination porn out there basically since Donald Trump descended the escalator rather, at Trump Tower. And then you have Joe Biden, and he tries to compare this assassination to, of course, the Gretchen Whitmer Fednapping case. And the rhetoric continues of the threat to democracy, et cetera. And I'm very careful when it comes to, you know, linking the rhetoric and the environment that the left has created. Plus, of course, we can set aside for a moment all of the left's political violence that dates back decades in this country, exploded in the 70s. And of course, we saw it with the BLM riots as well. I'm very careful to be very cautious when it comes to linking rhetoric to action, because this is always the predicate for censorship that the left would use to go against us. But the attempt to both sides this is sickening and shameful. The fact that you had Morning Joe, they wouldn't even put it on the air, which I think tells you everything you need to know about where they're coming from. And then you see the lawfare persists. You don't see Joe Biden coming out there, despite some Republican senators asking him to drop the lawfare, in a show of unity and that you really want to bring the country together and lower the temperature. It's all still there. There was polling that I think was reported on the New York Times, which showed that I think 10% of Americans were okay using force to prevent Donald Trump from assuming office again. I'll have to find the link to it and share it, but I don't think that's surprising. And we're talking about millions of people then essentially who take that perspective. And of course, let's remember that this is sort of the culmination of a slew of acts to personally, politically, and legally assassinate Donald Trump. So where did we think ultimately the animus was going to bubble over into? That aside, in my initial reaction to this was outrage and just a deep and profound sadness that we were here, even if it was a predictable consequence or this was a predictable outcome of everything that we have seen, again, you know, since 2015. Not only sickening on its face, but then also the two major kind of questions that we're left with now about how the hell did you have the level of, at very, very, very best, based upon the details we've seen, gross incompetence from a Secret Service where there's a long line, by the way, of gross incompetence dating back years of security failures with fence jumpers at the White Houses, agents carousing in Cartagena and getting into trouble, all sorts of different issues that have been pointed out by Congress for years regarding the Secret Service. How did someone get on this roof? Is the excuse that the roof was sloped too steeply and so there couldn't be actual law enforcement up there? Is that really what they're gonna go with? Is it true that, as has been reported by sources, that the rules of engagement say Secret Service can't shoot unless a target is fired upon first? That is just utterly absurd. The fact that you didn't have agents, all of whom could protect Donald Trump when standing up on stage, and that he was still exposed on stage after the agents brought him up, even knowing that the shooter was neutralized. But what if there had been another shooter somewhere? The fact that he was still a sitting duck on stage is insane. The clumsiness of the agents not being able to holster their firearms. The fact that this person apparently was viewed as a suspicious person a half hour before the shooting took place, setting aside the split screen video that we've probably all seen of the 2 minutes when Trump is speaking and you have people on the ground saying, what is this guy doing on the roof? I mean, it just beggars belief, the level of incompetence. And then, we hear that resources were not surged to the Trump campaign when it asked for it. And then you have the security services disputing that. But then Joe Biden happens to be at an event in Pennsylvania around that time as well. And so Secret Service resources are diverted to her. All of it stinks to high heaven. 0 heads have rolled to this point. And at its highest level, this kind of proves one of the central Donald Trump arguments, which is that we have massive bloated institutions that are supposedly so sophisticated and smart, and yet they can't or won't execute their most basic functions. In this case, namely, protecting one of the highest valued targets in the world. And then we have the DEI aspect of this that the Secret Service has pushed for. And now we have the FBI coming in to run the investigation, an FBI that hates Donald Trump at the highest levels. And do we really think we're going to get a serious investigation from them, one that they're going to be open and transparent about? And the last question that I'll ask is not rhetorical. How do we not know anything about this gunman? But all we've heard is the FBI say, we don't know what the motive is yet. I wonder what the motive was. And that they can't unlock the guy's phone. I mean, that's pretty hard to believe. It's pretty hard to believe there'd be no record out there. But how can we trust any of these institutions? And all of that is just kind of making the case, once again, that Donald Trump has made. These institutions are rotted, corrupted, and or incompetent. And the only solution is to fire all the people across them and start fresh.
Yeah, a few points. One on unity or temperature lowering or whatever. I think it's really important in this case to separate 2 things out. One is a appropriate sense of sobriety that, as Ben said, we find ourselves here. This program is no stranger to talking about crossing Rubicons. We all have recognized many, many times. And it's not that, there haven't been assassination attempts and successful ones on American presidents in the past. But a sense of sobriety and prudence while understanding just how deep the crisis is in this country, I think is appropriate. I hope that sense of sobriety is spreading in the country. I think it is why you're seeing a lot of people endorse Donald Trump who might have, otherwise have issues with him or whatever, because the sense of reality about this crisis is actually seeping in for a lot of people who have not been following it perhaps as closely or just have a different perspective about it than the people on this podcast. That's a different thing than the constant demand for, quote, lowering the temperature that only applies one direction. It's actually different from moderation itself, right? It may be that the seriousness, and I think it is the case, that the seriousness of the crisis in the country actually demands the most sober course of action is not moderation, but is to look at these institutions, as Ben said, look at the media, look at the institutions, look at how far the rot really has gone in America and address it as radically as possible. That is, in fact, to my mind, the most sober response to something like this. About specifically the media, I mean, the response was insane. There's no other way to put it. I think Will and Amber mentioned a few examples of it, but you had headlines at CNN saying Trump falls on stage for hours after the assassination attempt took place. You had a headline, just in Newsweek that was insane, just like across the board, AP headlines that were insane, all of them avoiding the phrase assassination attempt. And it does reinforce that we live in a propaganda, environment in the media where even something like this, just where it's very important in live time information, which, by the way, there's an interesting aspect of this, that Twitter was so far ahead of the news media that essentially by the time you get to the evening programs, it's just a rehashing of the things that were broken on Twitter. But in any case, aside from the structural changes in the media, I mean, the kind of attempt initially to spin this was, I mean, predictable, but in some ways unbelievable, given how obvious it was that that was going to, you know, that headline structure and narrative was going to fall apart. It really does beg the question how, you know, how stupid the people who write those headlines think we are, that they think that they could get away with writing a headline like that with something that is so sort of cut and dry and obvious. And then finally, the security services, the incompetence of Donald Trump's security and the Secret Service, I think can be boiled down to two different types here. One, increasingly what we're seeing is something that looks, you know, more like Uvalde style incompetence, where we have multiple contacts with the shooter or people noticing him, not just outside of the service, but inside of the service before the assassination attempt takes place. And then the second set of this incompetence is clearly due to DEI, right? It's clearly due to advancement. I think the most obvious case is actually the woman who did a great job. There's a lot of Keystone Cops, you know, Reno 911 footage of women by the car, like the woman who was unable to holster her gun, all of that stuff. But there was a woman who actually performed her job, the one closest to the president with the bun, as courageously and competently as any of the men, except that she was 1.5 feet shorter than the president. And the reason that we got those iconic photographs is because his entire head and torso are exposed, because the details of his security are not as tall as him. Like, that's a physical limitation that cannot be overcome with platitudes about equality. So I think that is a really important discussion we're going to have around this. We'll go ahead and talk about how this has started to impact the election, and the first sort of piece of how that's going to affect the election, although it has nothing to do directly with the assassination attempt. It followed literally 12 hours afterwards, which is a decision in the case against Trump in Florida. So Ben, if you could set that up for us.
Yeah, so while I think all of us were still somewhat stunned and trying to process the images that came before us, following up maybe one of the most iconic images, I would argue, in American history, frankly, certainly in modern history, of Trump stalwart standing up, blood from his ear, American flag in the background, even though the New York Times cropped it out, saying fight, and adamant that we're going to stand up to anyone who would try to cut down this movement and really the country at the end of the day. Then Judge Cannon set forth a massive ruling out of Florida, sure to draw the ire of the left and maybe only diminish because of the focus on what had just transpired in Pennsylvania. As I covered a couple weeks back, in the concurrence, in Justice Thomas's concurrence in the presidential immunity case, he focused on a different issue than the majority, which was, is special counsel Jack Smith actually lawfully sitting in that special counsel office? And he urged the lower courts to consider this question, kind of a fundamental question. You're talking about the special prosecutor, the special counsel behind obviously the two federal cases against Donald Trump. Well, Judge Cannon had been briefed on this issue. There was an amicus brief filed by the former Attorney General, Ed Meese, on this issue as well, calling into question the legitimacy of Smith's office. And so in this massive ruling, Judge Cannon essentially said that special counsel Smith is not lawfully in his position, and that the only remedy is to dismiss the so-called mishandling of classified documents case in full. So a massive ruling, especially on one that most of the establishment said, well, of all the cases, this was probably the one where Trump was most likely dead to rights. The case has now been dismissed by Judge Cannon. I went through a really long thread on Twitter breaking down some of the key excerpts from it. I'll just read a couple components of it here, and then we can talk about what the significance of this is and then what happens from here. But Judge Cannon said, the basic question at issue is there a statute in the United States Code that authorizes the appointment of special counsel Smith to conduct this prosecution? After careful study of this seminal issue, the answer is no. None of the statutes cited as legal authority for the appointment, and it goes through the regulations in the order appointing special counsel Smith, gives the Attorney General broad inferior officer appointing power or bestows upon him the right to appoint a federal officer with the kind of prosecutorial power wielded by Special Counsel Smith. Nor do the Special Counsel's strained statutory arguments, appeals to inconsistent history, or reliance on out-of-circuit authority persuade otherwise. And a couple points, she really takes Jack Smith to task for not taking this challenge seriously. And there's been a constant battle between Judge Cannon and Smith, because Smith and the rest of the DOJ lawyers act as if they're way above the fray. And this judge is a joke for asking basic questions about the obvious defects in their case, stemming from now the defective office, according to the judge. So she adds, the bottom line is this: the appointments clause is a critical constitutional restriction stemming from the separation of powers, and it gives to Congress a considered role in determining the propriety of vesting appointment power for inferior officers. The special counsel's position effectively usurps that important legislative authority, transferring it to a head of a department, and in the process, threatening the structural liberty inherent in the separation of powers. Part of the ruling is also not only that the office is unlawful, but there have been appropriations put forth dedicated to the office that are unlawfully appropriated. So this is a massive case, really dealing at the end of the day with separation of powers. And did the legislative branch create Jack Smith's office or delegate the power to Attorney General Merrick Garland to create this office and engage in a lawfare inquisition against Donald Trump? And if Judge Cannon's ruling holds, this obviously would also invalidate the prosecution, the January 6th related prosecution. So obviously, Jack Smith's side has already said they're going to appeal this case. Some commentators on his side are saying that he's going to push to get Judge Cannon thrown off this case ultimately. So not only to have the ruling overturned, but get her thrown off of it. But obviously, this gums up the works even more for the Florida case. It imperils potentially the DC case. And it feels as if there is at least some justice today, because again, the lawfare inquisitionists have really been checked at every single turn, with the exception of the New York case. And we'll see how that ultimately plays out. But with that, I'm curious, what's your all's take on where this goes from here and what the ramifications are?
I just want to pull out 10,000 feet for a second. The legitimacy of special counsels generally, not even this particular appointment, requires you to accept tacitly, and I think a lot of people don't think this through, the idea that there ought to be totally unaccountable law enforcement, guys with guns who are not politically accountable in any way. I know that it sounds good to talk about independent investigation, right? But what it actually means to have independent investigation free of political oversight is to give guys with guns no direct lines of accountability whatsoever. And yes, this is done ostensibly to investigate people in power, but we have to think about, like, the as this case does, the separation of powers issues involved. And I think people confuse sort of the prudential aspect of, yes, it's generally, as a day-to-day basis, a good thing to have a Department of Justice that doesn't, operate in a political manner where they're constantly calling up the political actors and saying, who do you want me to investigate, right? But at the end of the day, those guys and gals over at DOJ have to be responsible to the president, because otherwise they're not really responsible to anyone. So that's one of the sort of separation of powers issues here is, does Congress have the power to essentially carve out a piece of law enforcement and say, we're giving you guys sort of this independence because we need this office as a special counsel. And then there are questions about, if you do that, okay, well, what kind of accountability exists for that office? How should those people be appointed? And that's what the Florida case really deals with. But I didn't want to give that background, because I think sometimes our instincts are off in that, because on a day-to-day basis, of course, a well-functioning, law enforcement apparatus is not, subjected to the whims of the political, sort of order in a day-to-day way. But ultimately, it is much scarier to have no political accountability over law enforcement than it is to have political accountability over law enforcement. And I think this is really clear to everybody on the municipal level, right? If you talked about the police department not being responsible to the mayor or even directly to voters, right? In some cases, the police commissioner is an elected position, right? In other cases, it's subordinate to the city council, which is elected, or to the mayor that's elected, right? Immediately, I think everyone would see the problem if we just had a police department where elections had no effect on their jobs or what they're doing. We would immediately see that that's not the structure of the system that we want. But for some reason, when it comes to this kind of enforcement, we forget about those distinctions.
Yeah, I think it's a huge victory for Trump. Obviously, I think it's the right decision. I can't believe Merrick Garland was so sloppy as to not appoint somebody who is already Senate confirmed. Just makes clear that their goal here was not to like provide some sort of neutral arbiter, but rather to pull a guy who was genuinely very partisan all the way out of his current work in The Hague to go after Trump like a bulldog. And so I'm glad to see that this whole thing is falling apart. I think Judge Cannon's ruling is correct. I remember reading Edmund Meese's brief about it and thinking it was very persuasive. And I suspect that it's going to be upheld by the Supreme Court. And I think that is well deserved because, you know, even if the Florida case was maybe the toughest facing President Trump, it was all part of this broader attempt to bring down the former president, bring him down with lawfare. 4 indictments in 4 different jurisdictions, a little over 4 months. That's ridiculous. We shouldn't put up with that. And especially given the assassination attempt on the guy. What are the Democrats trying to do? They're trying to put the guy in jail for the rest of his life over non-crimes. That's been the goal of Democrats for quite some time now. They don't care. They think he's a bad guy and they want him in jail. It's like, okay, obviously it's, has the legitimacy or the veneer of legitimacy of being part of the law, but ultimately Democrats have been trying to kill him in a different way. And so I think all this stuff needs to stop.
To me, one point of just one sentence, and then I'll let Amber jump in here. But I don't know that I agree that it was sloppy. It's just a clear example of wanting it both ways, right? Appointing Jack Smith and through improper procedures was intended to give the impression that he was independent and not directly exercising the will of Joe Biden, because that's what the administration wanted to project to the public. But it's not the procedure they followed, and obviously he wasn't independent. So to me, it wasn't sloppy so much as just another exercise of media compliance, right? This was a somewhat obvious exercise in wanting to have it both ways, to be able to claim the political benefits of having an independent investigation, right? An independent prosecution, while very clearly retaining the political lines of authority.
Yeah, and whichever theory you subscribe to, I mean, I think this is just the latest example of how grateful we should be that Merrick Garland did not end up on the Supreme Court, thanks to the essential obstruction from Mitch McConnell leading the Senate at that time, heading into the 2016 election. From this unjust, unconstitutional appointment of Jack Smith to his acceptance of the National School Board Association letter painting parents who protested as domestic terrorists, to his repeated indictments of pro-life activists for very trumped up cases related to the FACE Act, and just the general political weaponization of the DOJ really exposed Merrick Garland for who he is.
Yeah, I think the only question is, was he always this way or was he radicalized? But I think it's very clear that he is a vengeful man, and all of the hyper politicization and weaponization from the DOJ, and then by extension, of course, the FBI, I go back to, it makes it so that you can't really trust anything that comes out of the top levels of the law enforcement apparatus. And that puts us in a very perilous place. How are we going to trust whatever the report is that they ultimately put out on what occurred in Pennsylvania? It's a huge problem for the country. The institutions ruining themselves, discrediting themselves, makes it so that everyone essentially has to become a conspiracy theorist, because the official line, even if it may be true, is so hard to trust since the authorities have so eroded trust in themselves. And last point really briefly that I'll make is, in terms of the trying to get Trump for non-crimes or creating crimes to hang them around his neck. At the end of the day, the underlying crime for Trump is that he challenged their power and privilege. And you're not allowed to do that. Anyone who challenges their power and privilege, they have to be eliminated. That is how our regime operates. And that's why they've been on a jihad against this person when they could have tried to deal with him straight up like another political figure. And they might have actually been able to find common ground with Donald Trump in term one. Instead, they've turned him into their worst enemy, and they've galvanized a movement that potentially threatens all of the regime's power. Not that it will go quietly, obviously.
Yeah, I think what Ben is talking about is really the total loss of the political sphere, right? And it's not a new thing that we have a more technocratic, bureaucratic administration of government. It's something conservatives have been talking about for a long time. But with Donald Trump, essentially what we saw were the assumptions of a particular class of people with power in this country that had really only been the premises of politics that change, decade to decade for a couple decades, right? At earliest since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were sort of certain premises of politics from, the 90s through to, let's say, 2015. Those premises were starting to show serious cracks, and Donald Trump's success was a political response to that kind of those assumptions not applying anymore. And then what we saw was the naked, essentially, refusal of those people to cede, like to separate between their political preferences and their political assumptions and the application of power. It became a completely naked application of power that was a refusal of the political, a refusal to allow democratic forces, right, to guide the ship of state. And that's, I think, why we see all the, I'm sure on here, the rest of you have also used that phrase, right, on our democracy, right? The way that liberal democracy or our democracy has come to stand in for a set of very explicitly ideological political assumptions, even in the face of actual democratic correction against those assumptions, I think is demonstrative of that. And that's ultimately what's happened here. It's a regime shift and no longer like, and this seems obvious, and I know we've been talking about this, but it all seems so much more real after what happened in Pennsylvania, that we are talking about a regime change here, that we did go through at latest a regime change in 2020, and that now there's an attempt to essentially to roll that back, and that it's not going to be politics as usual or two small d democratic candidates standing up against each other in the election and just trying to convince the American people, because that's not the parameters of our politics anymore. With that, I mean, let's talk about the two candidates who are standing in front of the American people. We have a convention happening in Milwaukee, the Republican National Convention. Donald Trump yesterday announcing his vice president, Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio. So I guess I'll throw it out to you guys. What do you make of this pick? What are your hopes, or what are you already seeing in Amber's case for the convention? So maybe you can talk us through what you're seeing, Amber, since she's there at the convention, and then what you think of the VP pick and everything else.
Yeah, I'll start with the reaction at the convention, and I'm going to try to make it through. Apologies, I'm losing my voice already. I was talking all day yesterday, but the reaction actually in the convention center was rather muted. And I think part of it is that, shockingly, a lot of Republicans, even people who are party base members or delegates in this case at the convention, don't really know a whole lot about J.D. Vance, besides maybe the fact that he's like the author of Hillbilly Elegy. So I was sitting in the center when Trump sent out his Truth Social, and it was Mike Lee, I believe, when announcing his state's delegates all going to Trump, who mentioned that Vance had been chosen, and there was like a slight cheer, but nothing really crazy. And then for the rest of the day, people that I talked to were basically just echoing that they didn't really know much about Vance, whether he was a net positive or net negative to the ticket, and didn't seem to really understand the political consequences of him being chosen. But I think the most important aspect of this is that obviously Senator Vance is someone who has presented as a more populist member of the Republican Party. He has been fairly anti-establishment, more of an independent thinker than some other Republicans. And I think this is a very big sign that Trump is not interested in just handing the party back to the establishment when he leaves, right? He wants to cultivate a future class of people who can carry on America First policies. And he's willing to pick, someone a little bit riskier as his VP in order for that to happen.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so
Go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, this is probably not venturing far from the conventional wisdom, but this is kind of a fascinating pick in a couple of different ways. I mean, for one thing, this, I think, was Trump eschewing whatever the establishment was probably whispering in his ear and frankly pounding on the table over. You could see in the immediate reactions from the establishment, to some extent, recoiling in horror, in as downplayed a way as they could with the JD Vance pick, and that's all in part, or at least in my view, that's basically because this is a populist nationalist future heir apparent to Donald Trump. He'll run circles around Kamala Harris, I believe, in a debate if we get there. This is someone who I think will probably turn lemons into lemonade about the fact that obviously his past criticisms of Trump are going to be dredged up over and over. And I think he'll be able to make the compelling case. Here's where I was, and here's why I'm wrong, and here's why you should join me. And to that point, I do wonder, the conventional wisdom says JD Vance is the guy that's going to be traveling around Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania perpetually for the next 4 months. And that makes sense because this is someone who personifies forgotten Americans and can speak to them and is of them and from them. But I also wonder, to what extent is he going to be a powerful communicator to the suburbanite upper middle class voters in purple districts outside and within some of those states as well? Because he also combines that sort of forgotten man, Rust Belt American with the fact that he has elite pedigree as well and credentials in terms of the Yale grad school education and his time in the venture capital community. And by the way, it's notable that Silicon Valley money has come gushing in, and public endorsements of Donald Trump have come flooding in really since the Vance pick as VP. But I do wonder, to what extent is he going to be a powerful communicator for those who might be on the fence among those voters, again, in purple districts, to say, look, I was with you, I was against Trump, and here's why I came around, and here's why it's in your interest to come around as well, and the country needs it. I wonder if he may appeal more, or to an unexpected degree, to that cohort than even the Rust Belt cohort that it's assumed he's going to help drive out. But to me, this is a pick that was, yes, obviously there are political and optical reasons why this pick was made, but it's also an ideological pick at the end of the day. This is someone who I think is now the heir apparent to the MAGA movement, to the extent he knocks it out of the park as the VP candidate, and then, should they win, as the vice president of the United States. And I think it's a compelling package. It's a package that threatens the establishment because JD Vance, on both domestic policy and foreign policy, is much more in tune with the national conservatism view of the world, as was laid out in compelling and stirring fashion in his remarks not even a week before, or a week before we're recording this. And so I think it's a compelling pick. There was no slam dunk. This person makes sense because they're going to help Donald Trump take X state, or give Donald Trump Y in terms of backing that he doesn't otherwise have. And so I think, to the extent you believe that the vice president ought to be able to compellingly articulate and then help execute the Trump nationalist, populist, conservative agenda, you couldn't ask for someone who has better articulated it and has fought more doggedly for it than JD Vance.
Yeah, I'm not sure that vice presidential picks affect the actual election as much as people, in the consultants class or whatever seems to think. I think the main issue in this election will be Donald Trump himself. I have a really hard time imagining people who are not sort of Beltway denizens being like, well, I was going to vote for Donald Trump, but, JD Vance supports a child tax credit. So, I really do think this is a certain amount of Beltway projection, these distinctions, which are incredibly important for the future direction of the country, has been just laid out, but are mostly like not things that ordinary people are really, attuned to, the like sort of minute signals that show these different directions within the Republican Party. I don't know. I find that all to be a bit of Beltway projection. I don't think JD Vance particularly helps Trump win. I also don't think he's going to be a drag. I'm very happy with the pick for other reasons, which is not after this election, which I don't think JD Vance is going to be the deciding factor in one way or the other. I think he is going to be, first of all, if Trump is elected, he's going to be a competent vice president who is going to help Trump execute on the agenda that he's promising to the American people that is more national populist. I think that will be a really good thing in his second administration if he ends up having one, to have, because initially coming in, he used a lot of the apparatus of the Republican Party. And now the difference between, 2015, 2016 and today is that he's had the time for a lot of people to step into the sort of new politics that Donald Trump has been carving out. And JD Vance is one of those people. So between his intelligence and competence and the fact that he seems much more clearly aligned with what Trump's agenda is, I think that he will be an incredible asset to the administration after the election if they win, which to me is the more important part. Because as I said, again, I'm not sure that the conventional wisdom about pulling this state or that state, I think our politics is much more nationalized now, to the extent that the VP picks matter. It's exactly after the kind of week that we've had. It's, is there somebody who can step into, is there a legacy or a successor that can step into Donald Trump's shoes? And while I still think, JD Vance is going to have to prove himself, that certainly helps him in that regard, is for his bid to be that successor. If he takes this VP position and performs it well over the next 4 years. So in sum, I think this is much more important. I think this is a great pick. And I think this is much more important to the future of the Republican Party, to how this administration will be run if it's given the opportunity to enter the White House, than I think it is about like horse race politics in November, or the months between now and November.
Yeah, just echoing what Inez said, I think the horse race stuff is really silly when it comes to VP picks. I think historically VP picks have done very little to move the needle with different coalitions and groups. I think in particular, this was a great pick because I remember the first Trump administration with Pence sitting as the vice president, and establishment Republicans from almost the word go were willing to investigate and threaten impeachment of the president. They were really putting him, whenever the president pushed back, it's like, oh, well, we can just impeach you and get Pence. And even towards the very end of his presidency, they were willing to do that when, for example, President Trump was considering a pardon of Julian Assange. So I think the Vance as the vice president changes the dynamic entirely. Vance is not liked by the establishment wing of the party, and especially he is not liked by the establishment politicians in Congress. In many ways, they are more afraid of a Vance presidency than they are of a Trump presidency, because they think they can work with Trump. That's good. It will mean they behave. I still remember Richard Burr authorizing counterintelligence investigations into people like Donald Trump Jr. and just working hand in hand with Democrats who are trying to take down the administration. It'll be really nice to have a Republican presidency where the Republicans in Congress aren't working against the White House. And I think that Vance as the vice president makes clear which way is the executive branch going here. And it doesn't matter what you do, this is the direction of the executive branch. So that's a good thing.
I remember some people describing JD Vance as assassination insurance, and whether that's physical assassination, unfortunately, or assassination of the agenda. I think that's a great way of sort of laying out what Trump is sort of viewing his VP pick as. And it's not a strategic electoral pick. It's someone who is actually going to assist him if he wins in making sure that these policies continue, not just in his term, but even beyond.
Yeah, I think Amber's exactly right. I mean, this pick signals that Trump and the changes that he, articulates that Americans seem to want to go in the direction of, and the changes he brought in the first administration, and potentially, I hope, more of them in a second administration should he win, are not a blip in American politics. That DC is not going to be able to return to business as usual as soon as Donald Trump exits the stage, whether that's in the very dark formulation of assassination insurance, or whether it's simply because his term will be up, and because he is in fact an older guy, he's not going to be around forever. I think this is a good indication that things aren't going to go back to the way that let's say 2012, which is really the sense you get among Republicans still in Washington D.C., is that if we can just sort of ride it out, we can return to the party as it was in 2012. And that's, with this pick, I think, is the sort of strong medicine to say that that's delusional. That's not happening. With that, I don't know if anybody has final thoughts. I'll kick it off, just continuing about J.D. Vance, that I particularly appreciate, and I know Will appreciate, the fact that J.D. Vance introduced two pieces of legislation recently in the Senate, neither which went anywhere, but I think are a good indication of where his mind is at domestically, which is one, to strip all kinds of DEI positions from the federal government, and the second one, to tax endowments of universities. Those are two ideas, the policy ideas that are, good ones. Obviously, we talked about them here, but also I think are really indicative of how different J.D. Vance is from the median Senate Republican, because there isn't a lot of support for either one of those things from the median Senate Republican.
So, go for it, Will.
Okay. I wanted, on a completely different topic, yesterday, Gavin Newsom signed a piece of legislation, AB 1955, which prohibits school districts from notifying parents if their child starts using different pronouns or identifies as a different gender. That's what's on their school records. So, if your son or daughter decides that they're transgender and reveals that to teachers, there is no way, basically school districts and the teachers themselves are now prohibited from revealing that information to the parents of the child. It's a massive assertion of state power over parents. It's a complete disregard of parental rights. And it creates all sorts of opportunities for teachers to groom students secretly, knowing that that information cannot actually, it is illegal for that information, if it becomes the case, to be revealed to the parents. It's an appalling piece of legislation. It means that, children, if you're in California and you have young children in school, you have to take them out. You can't let them be in these public schools anymore, because in the event that you have some wackadoodle leftist teacher and they start working with your kid, you're never going to find out. You're not going to find out until the kid comes home and says, "Oh, guess what? I'm trans now." In a sane society, we would be treating transgenderism, gender dysphoria as a form of mental illness. We would be giving kids treatment for it. This is not the same as like homosexuality or anything different, which actually there is some evidence of like an ingrained thing. No, this is a massive social construction and social contagion that has huge downstream health problems that the recommended treatments for are bizarre. And it's one of those things that I can't believe how terrible California is becoming.
So briefly, to return to the vice presidential conversation for just another second, wholeheartedly agree. No one votes for a vice president. But what is unique about this case is this pick comes literally within days after an assassination attempt. And so it does take on different meaning this time. We'll see if that fades as we get closer to Election Day. And really on both sides of the ticket, obviously, because on the one hand, for the Trump side, you have the animus that we've seen across the country. And then you have more broadly the age of both of the people at the top of the ticket. So VPs are probably more significant, at least substantively, than is typical. And in this pick, I think it's worth noting, for those not all that familiar with J.D. Vance's views, The NatCon speech I thought was excellent at capturing kind of his perspective. And then also he delivered a speech to probably a hostile audience at the Quincy Institute a couple months back on his view on what a U.S. national interest oriented foreign policy looks like. And then back in 2021, he gave an address before Claremont's Center for the American Way of Life on woke capital. All of those more than worth your time to get some insights into his worldview and his intellect. On a totally different note, but somewhat related, I guess, I was struck seeing Donald Trump introduced and walking into the RNC, saw a level of emotion on his face and that he was truly moved in a way that I hadn't ever seen before, really, in a public setting, which I thought was just really striking and quite a remarkable moment that was captured. And the last thing I'll say, just apropos of nothing, is just we're incredibly lucky as a people that by the hand of God, this bullet did not strike him, was in millimeters of his head. As many have said, this was an easy shot for anyone of basic competence. Thank God we are not in the totally opposite position today. And let's hope that this is an inflection point for the country and a rallying point to restore our republic, and not just another thank God failed, but another kind of point on the road to the destruction of our republic.
Because of the news surrounding Trump over the past week or so, the attempts from some Democrats to get Biden to step aside from the nomination were quieted, but they're starting to come back. The chatter is increasing again. Adam Schiff reportedly said in a private fundraiser that if Biden is their nominee, he thinks that they lose not just the presidency, but also the Senate. So I think we can probably expect this sort of internal Democratic warfare to ramp up again heading into the next few weeks. That's definitely something we should keep our eye on. Of course, Biden still has to choose to step aside, but the deadline essentially for him to do so would be the first week of August, because that is the deadline for candidates to appear on the Ohio ballot. So they're running out of time for making a decision.
And I think that wraps it up for us this week. An incredibly consequential week, both for the election and as we said at the outset, for the country, for the history of the country, the future of the country. Second everything that Ben said, and on behalf of Amber, Ben, and Will, thanks for tuning in. I'm Inez Stepman, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.